Hello, everybody. So this is going to be kind of a review over the presidencies of Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. So I'm really just going to quickly go through some different slides and really just talk about the different presidents that we have covered and the major events that took place during their presidencies. So obviously the first president that we have is President George Washington. We talked about the original election in which he received all the electoral votes. And so just a reminder that at this time during the election, first place would become president and second place would become vice president. And so there was very little campaigning at this point in time, and George Washington received every electoral vote in this first election. He is the only president to have done that. So while Washington was president, John Adams was his vice president because he finished in second place in that first election. Washington's cabinet was then formed. This is the first cabinet. We still have a cabinet today. And the cabinet is a group of advisors to assist the president. They're all appointed by the president. Well, they are nominated by the president, and then they are confirmed by the Senate. So that is an example of our checks and balances at work. The original cabinet was 3 members. It is now up to 15 members today. The Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. The Secretary of Treasury was Alexander Hamilton, and the Secretary of War was Henry Knox. So Washington had to deal with several different conflicts during his presidency originally, and so we have the economic crisis that follows the American Revolution. America is in a lot of debt because of the revolution. They owed money to different countries, and they also owed money to civilians who supported the war against Britain. And so Alexander Hamilton makes this plan to pay off the federal and state debts. He also creates the national bank and decides to place high taxes on imported goods. So Hamilton's plan, we're not going to go into too much because we've already covered it, but a lot of the states were opposed to it because they wanted to consolidate all state debt into one national debt, and a lot of the southern states particularly had already started to pay off their debt, and they did not feel responsible for paying off the North's debt as well. They also so they needed the support from the southern states to have that plan approved. And so the compromise that formed was actually moving the U.S. capital to the south, so to speak. And so that is how Washington, D.C. becomes the capital of the U.S. Thomas Jefferson, who was Secretary of State at the time, was not a fan of the national bank. He called it unconstitutional. And so that is the beginning of how we see Jefferson and Hamilton's conflicts start to occur. Hamilton said the national bank was necessary for eliminating national debt. So we start to see the divide of political parties here as well, because as we know, Hamilton and Jefferson end up being on opposing political parties, which we also know Washington warned against. He did not want factions, as they were called then, to form around political beliefs. Obviously, we know now that they do, and it continues to be a tradition of the United States for centuries later. So those factions that form are the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and the Federalists, who are led by Alexander Hamilton. And so these are kind of resulting of the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists in the form when they were forming the Constitution, similar groups. So the Democratic Republicans favored strong state governments, and the Federalists favored strong central governments. And the Democratic Republicans also favored a strict interpretation of the Constitution, so they took the Constitution very literally, and the Federalists favored a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Also, a major factor in Washington's presidency, a major event as well, was the Whiskey Rebellion. So part of this plan to raise money to pay off the debts was to tax whiskey. And so Congress created a tax on whiskey in 1791. And there was then a revolt by angry Pennsylvania farmers because they used their extra corn to make whiskey. And their whiskey is now being taxed super heavily, and they thought that that was unfair. Protests take place in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and President Washington himself personally leads militia to stop protesters. And so this kind of shows the difference between, we talked about Shays' Rebellion before the Constitution was formed. Shays' Rebellion was hard to put down because there was a very unstructured Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, that didn't allow for that to occur. Whereas under the Constitution and with the new government established, they were able to stop the revolt very well. And so the response from the federal government showed that armed protests were not acceptable in the new republic. In 1792, Washington wins all of the electoral votes. And then eventually, as all things come to an end, Washington does leave office. Washington decides to leave after 2 terms, which set the precedent for most future presidents until we get to FDR and that whole era. And then they eventually do create an amendment to limit the terms to 2 terms. He also set other precedents for future presidents. Isolationism is one of them, and warning of political parties or factions is the other, which we've talked about both already. And so we get a new president in 1796, and that's going to be John Adams. So in 1796, you have John Adams versus Jefferson. John Adams wins, which makes Jefferson the vice president. So Washington decides not to seek a 3rd term. Second place becomes vice president, like I said, and therefore Thomas Jefferson becomes John Adams' vice president. During Adams' presidency, he has the Alien and Sedition Acts, which is probably the most significant aspect of his presidency. So the Alien Act is an act stating that the president could deport any non-citizen resident considered dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. This isn't very popular with a lot of people, especially at the time immigration was a huge deal in the United States because we were still forming as a country. And this was introduced because Federalists feared the influence of immigrants, especially the French, and they feel that they would back the Democratic Republicans. And so as a Federalist, John Adams introduces this act, and it's a very tough point in his presidency, as well as the Sedition Act, which makes it illegal for anyone to say or write anything insulting or false about the government, especially the president, which we know kind of limits the freedom of speech, which is an right that is protected in the Constitution under the First Amendment. And so the Republicans say the acts violated the Constitution. The Alien and Sedition Acts, they say, violated the First Amendment in particular, and that Madison and Jefferson use the state legislators to respond. Under the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, the states would have the right to declare laws passed by Congress unconstitutional, which would essentially nullify the acts. So we also have conflict with France starting to occur during Adams' presidency. So France is upset with the U.S. because they are being neutral in the war between France and Britain, which we talk more about when we get into Jefferson as well. But they are upset that the U.S. is neutral, mainly because France heavily assisted the U.S. in their fight for independence from Britain. So you get the Jay Treaty, which is established because of John Jay, and so the U.S. pays long owed debts to British merchants, and Britain would pay for seized ships, remove troops from the Northwest Territory, and stop arming Native Americans. And so that's another reason that France is kind of unhappy with the U.S. They make this treaty with Britain, and they are paying Britain money, but it's debts that they had already owed Britain merchants. So then you get the XYZ affair. Adams sends 3 men to France to discuss relations, and France asks for a $10 million loan. The U.S. refuses, and that ends up causing a 2-year naval war with France. That is the quasi-war that we talked about. That is kind of an unofficial, undeclared war, but it is fighting with France. So in 1800, Jefferson actually beats Adams. So originally, Adams had won 1796. He serves 1 term, and then he is defeated by Jefferson. So in 1800, Jefferson wins, and essentially Hamilton even encourages Federalists to vote for Jefferson over Burr, because they did not, Hamilton and Burr did not get along whatsoever. We kind of briefly discussed that during class, if you remember. And Jefferson is finally chosen as the winner after 6 days and 36 different ballots in the House of Representatives to decide who would be president, because there was too close of a call. So as a new party comes into power, there is obviously going to be a change in policies. So Jefferson was very much supportive of states having control of the government. And so the power of the federal government over the states should be limited, according to Jefferson. He also believes in a term called laissez-faire, which is in the vocab that is also linked for you right now. And it is that government should not interfere in the economy. They should just leave it alone and let it be and do its own thing. Jefferson also supported removing Native Americans from U.S. states to land in the West, and he did actually keep in place the National Bank and tariffs on imported goods, which were introduced by Hamilton and originally opposed by Jefferson, but he decides not to remove those when he becomes president. The most significant thing that we have discussed so far that Jefferson is responsible for, in a way, is the Louisiana Purchase. And so he sends Monroe and Livingston to Paris to buy New Orleans from France. He really just wanted New Orleans and parts of Florida if he could get it. France, however, is at war in Europe and in the Caribbean. So there's a Haitian revolution occurring, which we've talked about. There was a slave revolution in Haiti, and they were afraid that they were going to lose base for defending the Louisiana Territory. They also needed money to fight their war with Britain. Napoleon realizes that he needs money to fight with Britain, and he comes up with this idea to sell all of the Louisiana Territory, including New Orleans, to the U.S. He originally asked for $22 million, but they do negotiate it down to $15 million. And like we had our whole long conversation about the Louisiana Purchase for a few days, there was a lot of decision going into whether or not the U.S. had the right to purchase territory, how that would work under the Constitution, how would the U.S. be able to purchase territory. Also, at the beginning of Jefferson's presidency, you have Marbury versus Madison. It's a court case that sets the principle of judicial review in that the Supreme Court can declare laws, not just laws, but actions taken by the other 2 branches as unconstitutional. Obviously, as many of you know, there's also the westward exploration, commonly known by Lewis and Clark's expedition. And so they are trying to discover a direct waterway route to the Pacific Ocean and interact with Native Americans. And they're kind of letting Native Americans know that this is U.S. land now, which is, kind of controversial now, because originally it was Native American land, and it was taken by France and then given to Spain and then back to France and then back to U.S. So this whole area of land has gone through a lot of exchange of hand, really. And so that is probably the most significant aspect to Jefferson's career as president. You also should have watched a video about the 1804 election, where Jefferson wins his second term as president, and the Embargo Act, which was a act that prohibited foreign trade. So it prohibited U.S. trade in foreign ports as a result of the war between Britain and France and how they were kind of handling American merchant ships. And so you should have watched that video as well. And this is a video that's really supposed to help you review for a short quiz over Washington, Adams, and Jefferson as presidents. Make sure that you do your exit ticket today as well, and I will see you in class this week.